Good evening, I'm Melissa Ridgen with your APTN News Weekend. Kookum scarves have become a trend on social media to show solidarity between Indigenous people and Ukrainians. One woman in northwestern Ontario is doing what she can to help raise funds for the crisis in Ukraine. Our Daryl Stranger has more.
Tanya Cameron has been searching far and wide across Canada to buy Ukrainian scarves for Indigenous women in Ontario and Canada. Proceeds from the sales of these scarves will be donated to help those in Ukraine.
It's a lot of women that want to stand in solidarity with Ukraine. We are watching the news coverage of parents putting their children on trains and buses to leave the city. We're watching young people stepping up, taking up arms to protect their country, and it's really emotional. And if this in small way where Indigenous women can stand with our kookum scarves with Ukraine, then I think this is a beautiful thing.
Cameron says she's been able to purchase around 150 scarves from various stores and vendors. One seller she reached out to was actually in Ukraine and unable to complete the order due to the current situation. One of the shops Cameron bought scarves from is Svitich Ukrainian Export and Import in Winnipeg. The owners are a husband and wife, and their family is still in Ukraine. They say they were touched when the scarves were bought.
This was such a wonderful gesture from a community from Kenora to come down and as a solidarity to purchase Ukrainian chustka to wear and support us in this fight. So I'm really touched, I'm moved, and it's such a wonderful feeling that you're not alone with this terrible fight with the enemy. So I'm really appreciate that.
Cameron is also holding an online raffle through social media with Ukrainian and Indigenous clothing and accessories. All proceeds from the raffle will go towards the Ukraine Humanitarian Crisis Appeal. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Two First Nations in Manitoba are suing the Manitoba government and logging giant Louisiana Pacific Canada, saying they were not consulted prior to timber cutting on their traditional lands. Here's Daryl Stranger again with more on that.
I'm not here to start a big fight over anything, a war or anything. I want accountability of where you're cutting, what you're doing, how you're supposed. You must have policies, how you got to follow them, and everything.
Wisquasipi First Nation and Manegwazibi Anishinaabe, also known as Pine Creek First Nation, are turning to the courts to force the Manitoba government and Louisiana Pacific to consult with them on commercial timber cutting. Wisquasipi filed their lawsuit earlier this week asking for a stop to ongoing logging and other forestry development.
It's hurting our environment. It's affecting our animals. It's affecting where we gather medicine, our berries. The animals, the birds, the species, everything. It's affecting everything. And if they just come down and sit down with us and understand the way we live and how we want to protect our animals and our stuff, we're not asking much.
Chief Zastry says they are entitled to a cut of the profits.
You're taking all our trees and you're selling them to whoever, and you're making money. Why don't you maybe compensate us a bit? Give us money for some houses. Give us money for infrastructure, a skating rink, or anything for our kids to benefit from. That's all I'm asking.
The claim follows a similar court action filed in January of 2022. Pine Creek First Nation is calling for a halt to logging in their traditional lands. That includes Duck Mountain Provincial Park and Forest. Jeremy McKay is a policy analyst with Pine Creek First Nation.
As you pointed out, we're asking the court to order or require the province of Manitoba to consult with Pine Creek First Nation. But the second part of this lawsuit is we're looking for the court to stop Louisiana Pacific's forestry activities until such time that an adequate process of consultation has occurred between Pine Creek and Manitoba.
McKay said Pine Creek would be open to a partnership, but the main focus currently is the rights of community members.
So we're definitely looking for consultation and to be included in the decision-making process. We do actually have a bit of a history in Pine Creek in participating in the forestry industry. So we're trying to protect space for that conversation to continue. But our primary concern right now is protecting the Aboriginal and treaty rights of our community members who rely on the Duck Mountain area to exercise those rights.
The Manitoba government said they were unable to comment on the matter as it is before the courts. Louisiana Pacific provided APTN with a statement on the matter. Although we cannot comment on pending legal matters, LP remains committed to engaging with Indigenous nations regarding our sustainable forest management operations. Both communities also expressed concerns over the decline of moose populations in recent years as a result of logging in the contested areas. The hearing dates for Pine Creek and Wasquesipi are March 1st and March 15th, respectively. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
A moratorium on hunting moose in Huron-Wendat ancestral land in Quebec may soon be imposed. The moose population in the Wildlife Reserve in eastern Quebec is experiencing a sharp decline. Experts say a 17% drop. Here's a story by APTN's Shushan Bacon, translated and read by Tom Fenario.
Le feu qui nous réchauffe, qui nous éclaire, qui nous permet de vivre.
Denis Gravel is known as a firekeeper in his community of Wendake. He enjoys sharing his knowledge about Huron-Wendat culture. In fact, it's his job as a guide at this educational Huron site near Quebec City.
Et puis, on repoussait tous les chevreuils vers l'enclos. Et évidemment, ils étaient canalisés vers l'extrémité et ils ne pouvaient plus sortir avec l'avance des chasseurs.
The techniques might have changed, but Huron-Wendat like Gravel still go hunting. Moose is usually Gravel's preferred game, but there's talk of a moratorium to moose hunting in the Pole-Neuf Wildlife Reserve, a territory in which the Huron-Wendat have been present for generations.
On est rendu à ce moment, à cette époque où on doit protéger la ressource pour qu'on puisse permettre à nos enfants, nos petits-enfants de pouvoir en profiter.
According to Jean-Pierre Tremblay, professor in the Department of Biology at Laval University, the science agrees with what hunters like Gravel have noticed. The moose population is in trouble.
Tous les indicateurs vont dans le même sens, la population diminue.
Tremblay says wolves, ticks, and parasites are contributing to the decline. And now hunting needs to be addressed.
C'est sûr que le facteur principal là, est celui sur lequel, le curseur sur lequel on est capable de jouer le plus facilement, relativement, c'est la récolte, là, parce que ça, on le contrôle à peu près entièrement.
APTN requested interviews with the Huron-Wendat Nation Band Council and the Quebec Ministry of Wildlife. Both refused, stating that discussions concerning the moose are ongoing. Meanwhile, Denis Gravel continues to tend the fire here. He says he's willing to stop moose hunting for the next season or two, if it allows the community to hunt in the generations to come.
Évidemment, tous ceux qui seront concertés, je crois qu'on en est rendu là. On doit laisser les querelles en arrière. On doit se réunir, créer cette alliance pour qu'on puisse protéger la ressource.
The Ministry of Wildlife and the Huron-Wendat Nation are collaborating on an aerial survey of the moose population in the Pole-Neuf Wildlife Reserve. The results will help determine if a moose hunting moratorium is necessary. A story by Shushan Bacon, APTN National News, Wendake, Quebec.
We need to slip away for a break, but when we come back, a Saskatchewan police service is under fire after a domestic incident led to the death of a baby. Stay with us. Welcome back. In Saskatchewan, 2 Prince Albert police officers will stay on the job after being called out for how they responded to a domestic assault that resulted in the death of an infant. APTN's Leanne Sanders has that.
13-month-old Tanner Brass was killed 3 weeks ago in the northern Saskatchewan city of Prince Albert. According to police, a 911 call came in the morning of February 10th in regard to a dispute. Kyla Frenchman of Thunderchild First Nation was taken to the police station. Just hours later, officers reported to the same address for the death of her child. Cage Brass was arrested for second-degree murder. Now, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations is calling for the officers who responded and the chief to be fired for ignoring Kyla's concern about her child.
When Kyla put the call in, it was clear she said, "My baby." They get to the residence and detain her. Again, she said, my baby. In the cop car, she said, my baby, and in the cells, she said, my baby.
Grand Chief Brian Hardlott says everyone needs to ensure this never happens to another First Nations family again.
I am troubled, very, very, very troubled on how this situation was handled. When all the support systems are there, all the government support systems that are there, all the First Nations support systems that we have, that they did not follow policy, their policy.
The First Nations leaders claimed during a news conference yesterday that the mother was ignored because she was Indigenous. She was too distraught to address the media. Prince Albert Police Chief John Bergen responded to the allegations late yesterday, saying,
as we work through and understand the details of the shortcomings of the Prince Albert Police Service, not just this one call for service, we're going to be in a better position to build back that trust that we're committed to work towards.
Bergen says the officers who responded had 5 years' experience between them. They're still on the job while the Public Complaints Commission investigates. He says the service now has a dedicated inspector to oversee its patrol division and ensure policy is followed as a direct result of the case. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
There have been several incidents between Indigenous people and taxi drivers in Winnipeg over the years. The latest, a woman from northern Manitoba called for a cab while she was in Winnipeg, and once the ride got underway, she says the driver pulled over and demanded cash up front. Here's that story.
Loretta Caribou is from Matthias Colomb Cree Nation in northern Manitoba and was visiting family in Winnipeg. On February 15th, Caribou says she requested a ride from a home to her hotel. She said once the trip got underway and midway through the trip, the driver stopped and asked her for cash before continuing.
I kept asking him why he was asking me. Was it because I'm First Nation? Right away, I thought about racial profiling. And as an Indigenous woman, I felt like I was being a target.
Caribou recorded part of a conversation with the driver asking why she needed to give a cash deposit.
But why are you asking me to give you a deposit before my destination?
We may ask for the money up front.
She eventually gave the driver the money as she did not want to be kicked out of the taxi.
I wasn't familiar with the area, and I didn't want to end up on the street because it was extremely cold that day. So I just gave him the deposit, and then even after I gave him the deposit, I still didn't feel safe. I still had that fear. If I pay him, how do I know he'll take me to my destination or just dump me somewhere else? That was the fear that I was still feeling.
APTN News reached out to the city of Winnipeg, who gave the following statement. Drivers are not permitted to stop a taxi and ask for a deposit/fare mid-trip. Drivers are permitted to ask for prepayment. However, they should only be asking for prepayment in cases where there is a known history of non-payment of fares. APTN News also reached out to Unicity Taxi for comment on the incident.
We're still investigating, and we have called the driver to ask more questions like what exactly happened, right? So further on that, then after we can make some decisions, like we need to take any disciplinary action on that or not, whether he said anything wrong to that person or not.
Caribou's experience prompted MKO, which represents First Nations in Manitoba's north, to issue a warning to First Nation citizens regarding taxis. MKO continues to have concerns about the safety of First Nation citizens using taxis in Winnipeg. We continue to call on all taxi companies and the City of Winnipeg to step up to ensure First Nations people can access safe taxi services. In the fall of 2021, a First Nations woman says she was assaulted by a Unicity driver. Winnipeg police later announced charges against the driver. And a First Nations man was also asked for payment after the trip had started in October of 2021. Caribou says she will file a complaint with the Unicity Taxi. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The Kookum First Nation in northern Alberta announced that 169 possible unmarked graves were found at the site of St. Bernard's Indian Residential School. APTN's Chris Stewart was there for that somber announcement.
Another residential school has been identified as having potential unmarked graves of children who attended the Gerard Mission and St. Bernard's Indian Residential School, operated from 1872 to 1961. In October, the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology from the University of Alberta used ground-penetrating radar and drones on 1 acre of the former residential school. Their results: 129 sites with probable graves, 32 possible locations, and 8 likely locations. 107 of the 169 probable graves were found at the community cemetery. Dr. Keisha Supernaut from the University of Alberta is Métis and led the search.
We do not need ground-penetrating radar results to know that children didn't come home from this school. The knowledge of survivors and the extensive archival records already contain clear information about children dying while in residence here. The use of ground-penetrating radar and related techniques are being used to try to identify where these children are buried, including those who may not be in those records.
Dr. Supernaut says she discovered during her research that she had family who never returned from that residential school.
As someone whose family members are in the records of the children who died at the school, I feel the pain of loss of those who should have been my aunties and uncles. Each of these children was a beloved part of a family, and no one has been held accountable for their deaths.
Chief Sidney Halcrow of the Kookum First Nation told those gathered that this discovery of unmarked graves will need a lot of healing.
The grief we felt when discovering our stolen children has opened fresh wounds. We remember the desolation of our people felt when our children were forcibly removed from their families, communities, to be placed in Indian residential schools. I would like to honor all the elders, survivors, who bravely shared their truth with us. Truths that were not believed or acknowledged for many, many years.
They're at birth.
Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta Grand Chief Arthur Noski called residential schools genocide.
Imagine sending your child to school one day, only to never see them again. When you inquire, you are refused an explanation as to where your child is or if they are even alive. Imagine your child is missing after being sent to school. No one is looking for them, and no one seems to be bothered to care. How would you cope? What would you do?
Upcoming searches will include a nearby Anglican church, the Indian agents, and the Northwest Mounted Police buildings. Noski says that the graves may not be exhumed and will discuss the possibility of that with leaders and elders. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Time for another break, but we still have more news ahead, so stay with us. Welcome back. A Cree elder in Alberta learned the skill of building canoes from his father, and one of their canoes is now part of history in the province. Now, as Tamara Pimentel reports, that elder is looking to pass the teaching on.
Well, my father was a man that wants to do things he completed. You have to complete what you want you're working on, no matter how hard it is.
Elzier Orr was in his 20s when he helped his father, Arnold Orr, make birch bark canoes from scratch in Chippewan Lake.
In those days, I was younger, and I didn't even think of coming back to that history.
The pair were commissioned by the Royal Alberta Museum in Edmonton. Now the canoe is in museum storage and not accessible to the public. But this film by Jean Gregoret remains in the Alberta archives. And it's something Elzier had recently rediscovered on YouTube. He met with APTN at the community center in Wabasca, Alberta for an interview. And when asked to reminisce of these times with his father, Alzir told his stories in Cree. Every aspect of this canoe is built with materials from the land. Here, tree roots are used to hold pieces together. Alzir says it takes over a month to finish a project like this, weather permitting, and he and his father made 6 more canoes later on. After seeing the film nearly 60 years later, Alzir hopes to see the canoe, but for now he begins to plan to pass the knowledge down. He sketched step-by-step instructions in hopes of finding someone who'd be interested in learning the art of canoe making. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Wabasca.
That was an incredible story there. Well, this week in Montreal, an agreement was signed between APTN and CBC Radio Canada. The memorandum of understanding will allow for more collaboration between the networks. APTN CEO Monica Ile and CBC CEO Catherine Tate put pen to paper this week. The goal of the agreement is to enhance both networks' abilities to create and promote Indigenous programming. There's also a commitment to recruiting, retaining, and advancing Indigenous employees and supporting Indigenous producers. Both APTN and CBC say they will retain editorial control of their content.
With everything that's been happening recently in Canada, with the recovery of the unmarked graves of the children, people are more sensitized, I guess, aware of what's going on. They want to know more. They want to know the real stories. And the real stories of Indigenous people are told by Indigenous peoples.
Thanks to your expertise at APTN, we have so much to learn and gain, and so we look forward very much to working with you.
That is a wrap on the news that was this week. I'm Melissa Ridgen. We are thankful that you could join us. We'll see you back here on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend.